In a cold prison room, under flickering fluorescent lights, a man in an orange jumpsuit sat silently, his hands shaking, his eyes hollow, counting the final hours of his life. Tomorrow was his execution. But before he died, he asked for one final request, a request that shocked every officer who heard it. He didn't ask for food. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for freedom. He asked to see his dog one last time. The only soul who had ever trusted him, his retired police dog, Shadow. The guards thought it was strange, even foolish. The officers expected an emotional reunion. But when the dog entered the room, everything changed. Instead of love, Shadow began barking desperately at his owner. The officers froze in confusion. No one understood what was about to unfold. Moments later, a truth exploded. One that shook the entire prison. Stay with us, because this story will leave you speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The prison woke before the sun did. Cold fluorescent lights hummed above narrow corridors, casting pale shadows across concrete walls that had seen too many final walks. Doors opened and closed with mechanical precision, each metallic sound echoing longer than it should have. This was not a place for mercy, only procedure. Every movement followed a schedule, every breath measured against the clock. And this morning, the clock mattered more than ever. In the center of it all sat the man, former K-9 officer, now inmate. He stood calmly as guards secured his cuffs, his posture steady, his breathing slow. No shaking hands, no frantic questions. He didn't look like someone about to die. He looked like someone waiting for something. That detail unsettled the guards more than any outburst ever could. Men who beg make sense. Men who panic are expected. But men who stay calm this close to the end? They don't. A guard checked the time and avoided his eyes. Another adjusted the restraints, watching closely for any sudden movement. None came. The man simply glanced toward the door at the end of the corridor. Again. Not fearfully, not desperately, almost patiently, as if he knew something they didn't, as if this moment was incomplete. The execution chamber was ready, paperwork signed, witnesses notified. The routine was flawless, rehearsed down to the minute. To everyone watching, the case was closed years ago. The verdict had been unanimous. The story settled. Yet standing here now, with the air heavy and the silence stretching, doubt crept in where certainty should have lived. As they began leading him forward, one guard whispered under his breath, barely audible, "You okay?" The man didn't answer right away. He took one more look at the door. Then he spoke, softly, evenly, "He'll be here soon." The guard frowned. "Who?" But the man said nothing more. And for the first time that morning, the clock seemed to slow. Years before the concrete walls and locked doors, his mornings began differently. Not with keys and cuffs, but with purpose. He wore the uniform with quiet pride, the kind that didn't need attention. Other officers trusted him instinctively. When situations turned volatile, his name was the one called over the radio. Calm under pressure, precise, reliable. He wasn't loud. He didn't boast. He just delivered results. At his side was the German Shepherd. Same dog, same intensity, scarred muzzle, focused eyes, muscles trained for action, not show. This wasn't a dog that barked for praise. He moved with discipline, reacting only when necessary. From the moment they were paired, something clicked. Training sessions felt less like instruction and more like conversation. A glance, a hand signal, a breath. That was enough. The dog didn't just follow commands, he anticipated them. They worked the hardest assignments. Drug busts, night raids, search and rescue operations, where time decided who lived and who didn't. More than once, that dog pulled officers out of danger. More than once, he led them to answers no human eye could find. When chaos broke out, the handlers stayed steady, trusting the dog completely. And the dog returned that trust without question. They were efficient, Because they believed in each other. Other officers noticed it. How do you control him like that? The handler would just shrug. He's not controlled, he'd say. He understands. After every mission, when the sirens faded and the adrenaline wore off, the dog would sit beside him, calm again. No celebration. No excitement. Just quiet presence. A partnership built on respect, not dominance. On instinct sharpened by trust. Back then, people spoke his name with confidence. If he was on the case, things would be done right. If his dog was involved, nothing would be missed. They were considered elite, not because they were flawless, but because they were consistent, dependable, honest in their work. No one, not the public, not the department, not even the men who would later testify against him, could have imagined this ending. A hero in uniform, a loyal K-9 partner, and a future that, at the time, felt unbreakable. The night everything ended began like dozens before it. A routine call, a late-hour operation, tension, but nothing unusual for a team that lived on the edge of danger. The city was quiet in that uneasy way it gets just before something goes wrong. Sirens cut through the dark as officers moved into position. Radios crackled. Orders were brief, professional, controlled. Then control vanished. Gunshots shattered the silence. Shouts overlapped. Footsteps ran in every direction. In the confusion, a suspect went down, dead. Another officer followed minutes later. When backup arrived, the scene was already poisoned by chaos. Blood on the floor, a weapon nearby, and one man standing where he shouldn't have been. Him. The German Shepherd was injured during the operation. A deep cut. Enough blood to matter. He was pulled away immediately, rushed out before he could make sense of what was happening. That moment, brief and violent, was the last time they worked together. No goodbye. No explanation. Just separation. By morning, the narrative had formed. Evidence pointed in one direction. His direction. Ballistics. Positioning. Testimony from officers who swore they saw enough. The case moved fast, too fast. Media labeled it an open and shut betrayal. A cop who crossed the line. A handler who lost control. Headlines didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. The public had already decided. He didn't fight back the way people expected. No shouting. No emotional defense. He answered questions carefully, almost cautiously, as if every word carried weight beyond himself. Investigators noticed, but interpreted it as guilt. Silence, after all, looks suspicious when everyone wants noise. The dog disappeared from the story entirely. Declared unfit. Too aggressive after the incident. Removed from service and reassigned to a holding facility. His reaction that night, never documented, never questioned, was buried under paperwork and assumptions. No one asked what he'd been trying to signal. No one thought it mattered. Within weeks, the uniform was gone. Badge revoked. Access stripped. Friends turned distant. Some avoided him. Others testified against him. The system did what it always does when certainty is more convenient than doubt. And just like that, a decorated K-9 officer became something else entirely. A headline. A warning. A man condemned not just by evidence, but by speed. The truth didn't vanish that night. It was simply left behind. The trial didn't feel like a search for truth. It felt like a performance already rehearsed. Cameras filled the courtroom before the jury ever did. Reporters whispered narratives into microphones, shaping opinions long before evidence was presented. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice, convinced they already knew what that word meant. Inside, the man sat quietly, hands folded, watching his life get reduced to exhibits and sound bites. The prosecution moved fast, too fast. They presented timelines that almost fit. Witnesses who sounded confident, until you listened closely. Details didn't line up perfectly, but no one seemed interested in slowing down enough to notice. The defense objected, but their voice was drowned out by public pressure and political fear. This wasn't just a murder case. It was about trust, and someone had to pay for breaking it. He was advised to show emotion, to cry, to protest, to tell his side loudly. He didn't. When asked to speak, he answered only what was necessary. No speeches. No pleas for sympathy. Each word was measured, restrained. To the jury, it looked like detachment. To the media, arrogance. To the court, a lack of remorse. But beneath the surface, there was something else. Something unspoken holding him back. Evidence that could have helped him was missing. Files mislabeled. Logs incomplete. A report that never made it into the final record. The dog's behavior that night was never mentioned. Not once. When the defense tried to introduce it, the judge ruled it irrelevant. An animal's instincts didn't belong in a human courtroom. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. The sentence followed just as fast. Death. As the judge read it aloud, the room held its breath. Some nodded in approval. Others looked away. The man didn't react. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight, absorbing the weight of a future that had just vanished. Somewhere in the building, a door closed softly. It sounded final. Later, when a guard asked him why he never fought harder, he gave a simple answer. "Because if I speak," he said quietly, "someone else pays." No one understood what he meant, and no one asked. By the time the courtroom emptied, the story was finished for everyone else. For him, it had only been buried, waiting. Death row didn't announce itself with violence. It arrived slowly in silence. Days blurred into each other, measured not by calendars, but by routines. Lights on, lights off. Meals slid through narrow slots. Footsteps echoing past a cell, never stopping for long. Time here wasn't meant to heal or change anyone. It was designed to wait. He learned the rhythm quickly. Wake, sit, stand, think. The walls felt closer at night, as if they leaned in when the lights dimmed. Some men shouted into the dark, desperate to remind themselves they still existed. Others cried until exhaustion took over. He did neither. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments he refused to forget. Guilt lived with him, but not the kind everyone assumed. Not guilt for the crime, but for the silence he chose. Every appeal offered him a chance to speak more, to accuse, to expose. Lawyers urged him to fight harder. He declined. Each time, his restraint puzzled them. To him, it was necessary. Speaking freely would have dragged someone else into the fire, and he had already lost enough. The dog came back in his dreams, always the same, running toward him, stopping just short, alert, focused, trying to show him something he couldn't reach. He would wake with his heart racing, hands clenched, the echo of pause fading into the concrete. The guards thought the dreams were about regret. They were wrong. The dreams were warnings. Once a year, he was allowed to write letters. Most inmates wrote to family, to journalists, to strangers willing to listen. He wrote to only one place. Same address. Same few lines. No explanations. No apologies. Just a quiet hope, folded into paper and sealed away. Years passed. Hair grayed. Strength faded. The world outside moved on, convinced the system had worked. Inside, the clock kept ticking toward a date no one bothered to announce until it was close enough to matter. And when that date finally came, the man didn't ask for mercy. He asked for something else entirely. Something he believed was still listening. The night before the execution was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No shouting. No last-minute chaos. Just paperwork, footsteps, and the low hum of electricity moving through the walls. The man sat on the edge of his bunk as a guard stopped outside his cell, clipboard in hand. This was the moment every inmate waited for, whether they admitted it or not. Final requests, the guard said, without looking up. The man didn't answer right away. He stood slowly, joints stiff from years of confinement, and stepped closer to the bars. The guard expected the usual things. A phone call, a meal, a chaplain, something human. He had heard them all before. What he didn't expect was the calm in the man's eyes, or the absence of fear. "I don't need a priest," the man said evenly. "I don't need a call." The guard finally looked up, surprised. Then what? For a moment, the corridor felt longer than it was. The man's voice stayed steady, almost gentle, as if he were asking for something simple. "I want to see my dog." The words hung there, unanswered. The guard frowned, flipping through procedures he already knew by heart. There was no section for that. No checkbox. No protocol for animals in execution chambers. This wasn't a request, it was a complication. He shook his head, slightly. "That's not how this works," he said. "I know," the man replied. "But he needs to be here." Needs. Not wants. The guard hesitated, then marked something on the clipboard. He didn't argue. He didn't promise anything either. He simply nodded and moved on, footsteps fading down the corridor. When the cell went quiet again, the man sat back down. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to exhale fully. If the request was denied, nothing would change. If it was granted, everything might. Somewhere beyond the walls, a decision was being debated. Paper passed from one desk to another, and without realizing it, the prison had already stepped onto a path it couldn't walk back from. The request moved slowly, as if the building itself resisted it. Forms were passed from one office to another. Phones rang, then went quiet. No one wanted to be the person who approved it, and no one wanted to be the one who denied it either. This wasn't about compassion. It was about risk. Protocol existed for a reason, and this request sat far outside its boundaries. A senior officer read the file twice. Former K-9 handler. Death row. Final request. Police dog. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. Bringing an animal into an execution environment raised too many questions. Safety. Liability. Media fallout. What if something went wrong? What if the dog reacted? What if this turned into a spectacle no one could control? Others argued it was manipulation. A final attempt to delay the inevitable. One officer scoffed. "He knows the system. He's playing us." Another stayed quiet, remembering the way the man had looked during sentencing. Not angry, not desperate, just resolved. That memory didn't fit the manipulation theory, and it unsettled him. The warden listened without speaking. He had seen hundreds of executions. He prided himself on order, on clean endings. But something about this case had always felt unfinished. Not wrong, just incomplete. He glanced at the clock, then at the paperwork, waiting for his signature. Time was closing in. 5 minutes, he finally said. Under restraint. Full control. If the dog shows any aggression, we end it immediately. No one argued. The decision was written down, stamped, and rushed through channels that suddenly moved much faster than before. Once approved, it was as if the prison wanted it over with, to grant the request and move on. As orders went out, an officer paused in the hallway. "Why take the chance?" someone asked him quietly. He didn't answer right away. "Because," he said at last, "if we're wrong, we're already too late." The doors were set in motion. The path forward was locked. And somewhere in a holding facility, a German shepherd was being prepared, unaware that his next assignment would decide a man's life. The doors opened slowly, deliberately, as if the prison itself hesitated. Boots echoed first, then silence, and then the German shepherd stepped into the room. He moved with the same controlled posture he'd always had. Head level, shoulders steady, eyes sharp. Age had touched him, but discipline hadn't. Every guard noticed it instantly. This was not a broken animal. This was a working dog. The man looked up. For the first time that morning, his calm cracked. Just slightly, his breath caught, and his hands tightened against the cuffs. He didn't speak the dog's name. He didn't have to. Their eyes met, and something old and unspoken passed between them. Recognition, memory, trust that hadn't faded with time. The dog stopped. Not at the handler's feet. Not in the center of the room. He froze a few steps away, body stiff, ears shifting forward and back. His nose lifted as he tested the air, slow and deliberate. This wasn't confusion. It was assessment. The guards waited for a tail wag, a sign of comfort, anything familiar. None came. Instead, the dog began to circle. Once. Twice. Low, controlled movement. His nails clicked softly against the floor as his breathing changed. Shorter. Sharper. The kind handlers recognized instantly. This wasn't excitement. It wasn't fear. It was alert. Easy, one officer whispered, tightening his grip on the leash. The dog ignored him. A low growl escaped his chest, vibrating through the quiet room. Heads turned. Hands hovered near holsters. The man's eyes never left the dog. He knew this sound. Had heard it on night raids, in alleys where something hidden waited just out of sight. The dog wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking past him, toward the guards, toward the walls, toward something no one else could see. "This isn't right," someone muttered. The dog planted his feet, refusing to move, staring with focused intensity. In that moment, the execution chamber stopped being a place of procedure. It became a place of uncertainty. And whatever the dog had sensed, it wasn't emotional. It was trained. The tension snapped all at once. The German shepherd pulled hard against the leash, muscles coiling beneath his coat as if a switch had been thrown. Commands came fast and sharp, voices overlapping. But the dog didn't respond. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't out of control. He was working, driven by something precise and urgent. He moved past the man without a glance. That alone startled everyone in the room. A reunion had been expected. Confusion, maybe affection. Instead, the dog lowered his head and began sniffing along the floor, tracing invisible lines with focused intent. His nose pressed close to the concrete, pausing at seams, then moving on. Each step was deliberate. Guards shifted uneasily. One took a step back. Another tightened his grip on the leash, trying to redirect him. The dog resisted, letting out a sharp bark that echoed off the walls. It wasn't aggression, it was warning. A sound meant to create space, the kind used when something dangerous was close. The dog's attention snapped upward. He turned suddenly toward the line of officers. Not all of them. One. His body stiffened, ears forward, tail low. He advanced a step, then another, eyes locked with unwavering intensity. The growl deepened, steady and controlled. Trained aggression. Targeted. Intentional. The room went silent except for his breathing. Weapons came halfway out of holsters. "Control him," someone shouted. The man finally spoke. "Don't," he said calmly. "He's doing his job." The words cut through the chaos. The dog didn't break eye contact. He sniffed the air around the officer, then dropped his head again, tracing a path along the guard's boots, the cuffs, the floor nearby. His behavior was too specific to dismiss, too familiar to anyone who had worked with detection dogs. This wasn't emotion. It wasn't loyalty. It wasn't a reunion gone wrong. It was identification. The dog barked again, short, sharp, decisive, then positioned himself between the man and the guards, blocking the execution process with his body. In that instant, fear shifted, not toward the prisoner, toward the possibility that the wrong man had been chained to that table. And the dog knew it. For a moment, no one moved. The dog held his position, muscles tight, eyes fixed, breath controlled. The room was balanced on a thin edge between order and chaos. Guards waited for permission to act, unsure whether to restrain the animal or the man beside him. That hesitation, small but critical, was enough. "Wait." The voice came from the back of the room. Older, steady, unhurried. A veteran officer stepped forward, his uniform worn in a way that couldn't be faked. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He watched the dog instead, eyes narrowing, not in fear, but recognition. He'd seen this posture before, too many times to mistake it. "That's not aggression," he said quietly. Someone scoffed. "He's out of control." "No," the veteran replied. "He's focused." The dog barked once more, then lowered his head, sniffing again. Boots, cuffs, the edge of the wall. The older officer followed the movement with slow steps, careful not to interfere. He knelt slightly, studying the angle, the pattern. Every movement matched something etched deep in his memory. "I worked K9 for 20 years, he continued. "When a dog reacts like this, he's not protecting someone. He's identifying something." The room stilled. "He's not reacting to the prisoner," the officer said, voice firmer now. "He hasn't been, not once. He's reacting to a scent, a trace, something that shouldn't be here." Eyes shifted. Doubt crept in. Another guard shook his head. "This isn't a search." "It is now," the veteran answered. The man on the table said nothing. He didn't need to. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The one he couldn't force, only hope for. The dog circled again, then stopped abruptly near the wall, pawing once before barking sharply. The veteran officer stood. That alert, he said, turning to the warden, means evidence. The word landed heavier than any accusation. Phones were already coming out. Procedures unraveling. The clock ticking louder than before. And for the first time since the execution process began, the question in the room wasn't when it would happen, but whether it should happen at all. The room shifted from control to urgency in seconds. The veteran officer followed the dog's movements carefully, eyes tracing the exact points where his nose lingered. The German shepherd pressed closer to the wall now, breathing faster, tail rigid. He barked once, sharp, decisive, then scratched at a narrow seam near the baseboard. The sound cut through the chamber like a signal flare. "Check that," the veteran said. 2 guards hesitated, then moved in. One ran a hand along the wall, fingers brushing against something uneven. A panel shifted slightly under pressure. It shouldn't have. The room wasn't designed for storage, let alone concealment. Someone pried it open. Inside was a small, sealed evidence pouch. Silence fell hard. The bag was old, discolored. The label smudged but still readable. Case number from years ago. The same night. The same operation. A quick glance confirmed what no one wanted to believe. Trace residue. Logged once. Never followed up. Never entered into final reports. The dog barked again and sat, perfectly still. "That's a confirm," the veteran officer said quietly. Hands trembled as the pouch was removed. A forensic tech was called in immediately, eyes widening as she read the label. "This was supposed to be destroyed," she whispered. "Or processed. I don't understand how it ended up here." No one answered. Phones rang. The warden's face drained of color as he stepped aside to make a call. Then another. And another. Timelines were pulled up. Logs reopened. A security feed, archived and forgotten, was suddenly relevant again. A timestamp flickered onto the screen, off by minutes. Enough minutes to matter. The man watched from the table, heart pounding now. Not relief. Not yet. The dog stood and moved again, nose low, leading them a few steps farther, toward a locker. One belonging to an officer who had testified with confidence all those years ago. The same officer the dog had fixated on earlier. The pieces were aligning too cleanly to ignore. A supervisor swallowed hard. "This changes everything," he said. The veteran officer nodded. "It always did. We just didn't listen." The dog returned to the man's side and sat, calm at last. For the first time since entering the room, his breathing slowed. His job, unfinished for years, was finally complete. The execution clock kept ticking. But now, every second carried a different weight. Because buried in that wall wasn't just evidence. It was the truth. And it had been waiting for the one voice that couldn't be silenced. Everything stopped at once. Not slowly. Not carefully. The kind of stop that comes from panic, disguised as authority. The warden stepped forward, voice sharp, cutting through the noise before it could grow. Orders were issued, then repeated, as if saying them twice would make the situation real. "Stand down. Now." The medical team froze where they were. One hand hovered inches from the equipment. Another dropped to his side, unsure what to do next. The execution chamber, built for finality, suddenly had no instructions for uncertainty. No one had rehearsed this moment. No checklist existed for doubt. "Pull the clock," the warden said. A technician hesitated, then complied. The digital timer went dark. In the silence that followed, the man finally felt it, his body reacting to what his mind had been holding back. His chest tightened. Breath came faster, uneven. Not relief. Not yet. Just the shock of being stopped after years of moving toward one inevitable point. Phones rang across the room. Attorneys were called. Investigators alerted. Superiors notified with clipped sentences and strained voices. Every call ended the same way, with disbelief. Paperwork that had once sealed a fate was now being questioned, one line at a time. The dog remained still, sitting beside the table, head up, eyes alert, not anxious, not restless, as if he understood that the danger had passed, for now. A guard reached out instinctively, then pulled his hand back, unsure whether it was allowed. The warden turned back to the room. "This execution is postponed," he said. "Effective immediately." No cheers followed. No relief-filled exhalations. Only stunned quiet. Because everyone understood what this meant. If the process could be stopped this close to the end, then it should never have gone this far. As they began unfastening the restraints, the man closed his eyes, not to pray, but to steady himself. Years of silence had led to this single pause. And in that pause, something impossible had happened. Death had been delayed. And for the first time, truth was no longer running out of time. The investigation didn't move slowly this time. It exploded into motion. Calls stacked on calls. Orders bypassed usual chains of command. Files that had gathered dust for years were pulled from storage and spread across tables under harsh white lights. Every assumption was questioned. Every signature re-examined. What had once been labeled final was suddenly fragile. Security footage was the first crack. An old camera angle, dismissed as useless years earlier, was replayed frame by frame. A timestamp didn't match the official report. Only by minutes, but those minutes rewrote everything. Someone had been in a place they swore they weren't. Someone else had arrived too late to do what they were accused of. The room grew quiet as the realization settled. Witness statements unraveled next. Small inconsistencies surfaced. Phrases repeated too perfectly. Details remembered the same way by people who shouldn't have shared memory. Under renewed questioning, confidence faded. One officer asked for a break. Another refused eye contact. The pressure that had once been aimed at one man shifted, slowly, unmistakably, toward someone else. The dog's behavior was reviewed last. Not as emotion, not as coincidence, as data. Handlers explained the alerts, the posture, the pattern of movement. Every reaction matched known detection responses. Not to fear, not to stress. To trace evidence linked to the original crime scene. Evidence that had been planted, hidden, and forgotten, until now. By the end of the day, the conclusion was unavoidable. The wrong man had been convicted. An arrest was made quietly, without cameras. The officer who had testified so confidently years ago finally spoke, but not in defense. Faced with timelines, footage, and evidence he couldn't explain, his story collapsed. What emerged wasn't brilliance, but desperation. A cover-up built on speed, silence, and the assumption that no one would ever look back. Paperwork followed fast. Charges were withdrawn. Sentences vacated. Emergency filings rushed through the courts with language rarely used. Wrongful conviction. Imminent execution avoided. The words carried weight, but not enough to undo the years already lost. The man was informed in a small room with no ceremony, no apology, no speech, just a simple sentence from an exhausted official. "You're free." He nodded once, not in triumph, in disbelief. Outside, the world buzzed with shock and outrage. Inside, something quieter happened. The truth, long buried, had finally been forced into the light. And it had taken 4 legs to find it. The gates opened with a sound he hadn't heard in years. Not the sharp buzz of locks sealing shut, but the slow, heavy release of steel giving way. Morning light spilled across the concrete, too bright at first, forcing him to squint. The air outside felt different, wider, unrestricted. For a moment he hesitated, as if unsure whether stepping forward would somehow undo everything. Then he took one step, and another. No cuffs. No hands guiding him. Just open ground. A few officers stood nearby, unsure where to look. Some avoided his eyes. Others watched silently, carrying the weight of what had almost happened. No one spoke. There were no words prepared for this kind of ending. The system didn't rehearse moments like this. He stopped when he heard it. Pause. Fast. Determined. Before anyone could react, the German shepherd broke free from his handler and sprinted across the open space. Years of training dissolved into instinct. The dog reached him and leapt, not wildly, not playfully, but with purpose. Front paws pressed against his chest. The force nearly knocked him back. He dropped to his knees, hands buried into familiar fur. His breath broke as the dog pressed his head against the man's shoulder, whining softly now, the tension finally gone. This was the reunion that never came in his dreams. This was real, solid, alive. For the first time since the arrest, the man cried. Not loudly, not uncontrollably, just enough to release years of restraint. Around them, the world held still. Cameras stayed lowered. Radios stayed quiet. Even the officers understood this wasn't a moment to interrupt. Justice had finally arrived. But this was something deeper than justice. The dog stepped back and sat beside him, calm again. Working posture replaced by quiet presence. Together, they stood and walked forward, side by side. No chains, no commands, just freedom, and a loyalty that had waited years to finish what it started. Years passed quietly after that day. Not in headlines, not in courtrooms, but in ordinary mornings and slow evenings that felt almost unreal at first. The man never returned to the uniform. Some chapters, once closed, don't need reopening. Instead, he chose something smaller, something honest, a life measured by peace, not purpose. The dog grew older. His stride slowed. His muzzle lightened with gray. But his eyes stayed the same, alert, intelligent, aware. No longer scanning rooms for danger, but still watching, still listening. They walked together every morning, no leash needed. The dog stayed close, not because he was trained to, but because he chose to. People sometimes recognized them. Some whispered. Some stared. A few asked questions. The man answered politely, briefly. He never spoke about the night of the execution. Never spoke about the room, the wall, the clock that almost ran out. Some truths don't need repetition. They only need to be remembered correctly. What stayed with him wasn't anger. It was clarity. He understood now how easily systems confuse speed with certainty. How silence is mistaken for guilt. How instincts, especially the ones that don't speak in words, are dismissed when they're inconvenient. The law had failed him. Procedure had nearly killed him. But loyalty hadn't. The dog had remembered what humans ignored. A scent, a moment, a truth out of place. He had carried it quietly for years, waiting for the one chance to be heard. Not with words, not with accusations, but with behavior so precise it couldn't be denied. On one quiet afternoon, as they sat together watching the sun lower itself behind the trees, the man rested a hand on the dog's back. The familiar rise and fall of breathing grounded him. This was the ending that mattered. Not revenge, not apology, but understanding. That justice isn't always loud. That truth doesn't always come from authority. And that sometimes, when every system fails, loyalty remembers. The world believes what it's told. Instinct knows what it senses. And sometimes, the difference between life and death is a voice without words that refuses to stay silent. Because truth doesn't always speak. Sometimes it barks.